Now, before the Romans came around and invaded Gaul and all that, the Netherlands and the whole lowlands was divided between the Belgae and other Celtic groups in the south, and in the north you'd have the Germanic tribes like the Frisians on the coast and the Batavians closer to the Celts, and also around and maybe into the Netherlands you'd have the Franks. The Celtic groups south of the Frisians and the Batavians would be conquered by the Romans, but the Germanic groups would remain independent during this time. The tribes would at times attack Rome, and Rome would counterattack and launch incursions into Germania, but the tribes, for the most part, would stay the same. Rome had been in a long period of decline, and they were being invaded left, right, and center by all sorts of groups: the Huns, the Germans, sorry, and the Franks as well. Yeah, things were that bad. The Franks would become the French, and they would be in France and Belgium and the southern Netherlands, and the only independent Dutch group would be the Frisians at this time. Now, Charlemagne would lead the Franks in conquering Frisia and Germany, but notably, Frisia wasn't pseudo-independent still. They still had some degree of autonomy. Now, the Frankish Empire would not last long. It would split up, and eventually the lowlands would be found in the HRE, which was a very functioning. There were lots of states in the Netherlands. There was the noble ones where the Frisians were still around. There was the bishopric in Utrecht, which was important. There was the county of Holland. It was a mess, essentially. Now, Europe at this time was experiencing feudalism. They were at the height of it, with lords and peasants and all of that. But this wouldn't be the case in Frisia. In Frisia, the peasants and mostly wealthy farmers, they would run the government, and there would be a pseudo-anarchy, democracy kind of thing going on, and they were very proud of it. This was called the Friesian Freedom, and it lasted for quite a while. Now the Dutch would begin building windmills. Um, it's claimed that these were to expand the land by getting rid of the water with the windmills, but we all know they were used for crack storage. Now the Burgundians would expand their influence into much of the Netherlands, but the Frisians would still remain independent, but they were, under the threat of Burgundian invasion. Now some Burgundian royal would die, and the Spanish, of all people, would inherit all of Burgundy, and this included the lowlands, and the Spanish would soon take control of the Frisian lands as well, meaning they owned Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, all of the Benelux. Now the Dutch would all be very upset at the Spaniards because they were, among other things, Catholic, while the Dutch were, for the most part, Protestant. And the Dutch would rebel against the Spanish. The Spanish would be very brutal when they retook cities or were dealing with heretics, as they would say, and this would turn many people to the rebellion. Now this made the Dutch cities very stubborn to surrender to the Spanish. There were instances of the Dutch destroying their own water drainage systems, so the Spanish army would be completely flooded, and they could move their navy in to the flooded battlefield to stop the Spanish assault, and this actually worked amazingly. Now the Netherlands would finally gain their independence with the help of the English and others, and the Spanish would be left with just Belgium. The Dutch would begin colonizing. They would settle in what would now be New York, and then called New Amsterdam, but this wouldn't last that long. It would be lost to the English in one of the Anglo-Dutch wars. The Dutch would have a successful colony in South America, in Suriname, where they would have great sugar plantations, and they would invade Portuguese Brazil, but this would be lost at eventually as well. But they would hold Suriname for quite a while. Back in the Netherlands, people began selling tulips for incredible prices, but in reality, we all know this was just a guise or a laundering scheme for the crack deals going on. Before the Suez Canal, to get into the East Indies where all the spices and money was at, you had to go around Africa. So the Dutch decided to establish a colony right on the tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, and this proved very successful. Now, the most lucrative Dutch colony would be the one in the East Indies, or Indonesia as we know it today. This was because of spices, which were very valuable at the time. Um, the Dutch would establish colonies throughout Sumatra, Java, Sulawesi, I don't know, southern Borneo, and Sri Lanka, and West Papua. And they would be very, very big moneymakers for the Dutch. Now, back in the Netherlands, things were going very well up until 1672, which was the disaster year. The French and the English teamed up to beat up the Netherlands. Truly quite sad. The English were defeated in a naval battle. Well, the French made good progress into the Netherlands, however, they forgot the Dutch loved to flood their own country, and they did it again, and the French and the British lost to the Dutch. However, this was at a very heavy price for the Netherlands. There was a lot of internal conflicts. They fucking ate a guy. Yeah, yikes. And, it was kind of the beginning of the end for the Dutch, in a way. Now, the Dutch had one last trick up their sleeve. They decided to get back at the English, who at the time had a Catholic monarch. So the Dutch sent the stadholder of the Netherlands over to England, and they just crowned him the new king. And that was that. There was a Dutch person on the English throne. Yay. There wouldn't be much activity in Europe really after 1672. There would still be wars, but for the most part, the borders would stay the same. The only real difference for the Dutch was that the Belgians were now ruled by the Austrians instead of the Spaniards. And apart from that, it was just everyone was just chilling. They were just chilling in the Dutch Republic. Now this is a long part. This long period of peace would come to an end. In the 1790s, there was the whole French Revolution thing. There was also a revolution in the Netherlands, but they didn't go anywhere. Um, so the French, they did their French thing. They crowned Napoleon and all that, and he invaded the Netherlands. He established a client state, whatever the hell. And the Dutch, they were steamrolled essentially. All of their colonies were now controlled by the client state that was under French rule, realistically. And then the English would seize them, such as South Africa, which they wouldn't get back, and a number of other colonies. Once Napoleon was gone, the Dutch helped with that. He came back at Waterloo. The Dutch were there too, and it was kind of sad. The Netherlands, their period of independence had ended. They'd been independent for so long, but you know, oh well. Um, but there was one upside of this. After Napoleon, the British would support the idea of the Dutch kind of forming a buffer state between France and Germany, or Prussia at this time. So they allowed them to take over Belgium, and it became the United Lowlands, and it was very cool for the Dutch. Now, the Dutch wouldn't be able to hold Belgium. They had a not very competent ruler, and the Belgians rose up and they became independent from the Netherlands. And that was that. Back to the old borders again. In World War One, the Dutch were neutral, but this wouldn't be the same in World War Two. The Germans would invade through the Netherlands and Belgium into France. They would both surrender very quickly, and then France soon after. So the Dutch would be under German occupation for the majority of the Second World War. Now, the last remaining major Dutch colony was in the East Indies, and the Japanese would occupy most of this. They would also occupy the Philippines, French Indochina, British Malaya, a lot of colonies, and it was not a good time for the Dutch, I suppose. The Allies, of course, would win World War II, and the Dutch would remain independent. But in the East Indies, there were a number of uprisings by the Indonesians against Dutch rule. At first, the Dutch would send in troops to try and put down the uprisings. It would be a very violent conflict, lots of death on both sides, I suppose. Other European powers would help the Dutch at first, but there's lots of pressure from the Americans to allow the Indonesians independence, and they used the Marshall Plan and rebuilding Europe as kind of a bargaining chip, and the Dutch would eventually withdraw from Indonesia and later recognize Indonesian independence. So that was the last real holdout of the Dutch colonial empire. Nowadays, the Netherlands is still around, of course. There's still all the windmills filled with crack. There's still all the clogs and other weird Dutch things. And it's there. That's that. That's it. Now in this video, a lot of the editing is kind of like it jumps around, and how I do it. It's very. I was kind of This is kind of an experiment, really, to see what things look like, how they turn out, what kind of editing works. So if you have any feedback, feel free to share. I hope you enjoyed, and goodbye. Also, there's a lot of things that I left out. I'll leave them in the description or something if I feel the need to, but this was not, a thorough, in-depth explanation of the history, of course. This is just me briefly going over what happened to the best of my capabilities, and how much time I was willing to spend on this. So, just clarify.